Welcome to Breakshift's hidden card tier list. I'm going to be ranking every collectible hidden class card with the following tiers. S tier is going to be for auto includes. These are cards that you'll more or less always put into your deck and use to great effect. A tier is for win conditions. These are strong cards that often form the backbone of a deck and will be chiefly responsible for winning fights. B tier is going to be for role-playing cards. These are cards that aren't exceptional, but do perform some specific task, something like blocking or applying vulnerable, and they make do when better options are unavailable. And then last we have C tier, which is for generally mediocre cards that you probably shouldn't bother using. We're going to classify all of these with respect to their rarity, since rarity generally correlates with overall power level in Vault. And I've elected not to physically put an image of each card on a tier list because there's 96 cards, and that's just too many. I don't think it would be legible at all or useful, so I'm just going to pull the cards up one at a time and flash the tier on screen that I think correlates to it. So let's get started with Ambush. Ambush is a B tier card. So, obviously the most important thing that this does is it gives you combo, and you always need to have the right balance of cards which gain combo compared to cards that spend combo. This is a pretty decent one to supplement your combo gain, usually in the early game, because it gets you full combo right away, and that'll help you close out fights really quickly. You know, like one fully comboed Slick Strike or something that you took off your mastery will end a lot of early fights, or kill the main dude. The Expel opener effect is handy if you just happen to draw this at the right time and you need a little bit extra damage. And, you know, there's some somewhat gimmicky ideas where you can do something like rig it with an upgrade or a green stone and just gain the combo immediately, and then you just sit on it and spam out balanced cards or something. But in general, this isn't top tier combo gain. It's just okay. It gets the job done. Next we have Anemia. This is another B tier card. It's not particularly efficient block. 2 for 9 is not a great deal. The fact that you're getting weakness on all bleeding enemies, of course, can matter. But more often than not, it's just going to be a little underwhelming in terms of how much defense you're actually getting out of this for what you're paying for it. You know, like, it's not that hard for an evade to be blocking for 8, just when you play that normally, and that costs 1 energy. If the enemy's already weak, of course, it's no more immediate defense, just extending that debuff. Overall, just it's an okay card, not exceptional. Next is Backpedal, and this is going to be our first C tier card. Backpedal is not very strong. It's really it has very little going for it, right? 6 damage for 1 energy is quite weak. Sifting 1 card is, I mean, it's useful. There are a lot of enemies that put garbage in your deck. You might be starting with Voids if you have Original Sin on or something of that sort. And it has Rebound, so, you know, it can be used to sift multiple garbage cards. It can get extra value out of Void Stones and stuff. A lot of very small upsides that it has, but it's not really going to form a cohesive part of your deck. Realistically, the only reason that you should bother putting this thing in at all is if you have an immediate need to help handle garbage cards. So pretty much just if you have several Voids in the deck already, you could consider Backpedal. And even then, it's not an exceptionally good way of dealing with them, but it is a way of dealing with them. Next we have Bide. And Bide is an easy A tier card. This card is very efficient, very powerful. It does a lot of good stuff for you. Obviously, like Ambush we were talking about, this is another 2 combo gaining card. but it's also just a really nice block card. 14 block for 3 is not exceptional, but it's good when it's stapled onto this other also very good effect. Almost any deck is going to need to have a couple of big chunky block cards, and why not get one that also facilitates the rest of your game plan? There are sometimes occasions where you'll end up with a deck that has enough other sources of combo gain and enough other sources of block that this just ends up being a little overpriced for the combo you're getting, right? If you're not benefiting from the full 14 block, then you will sometimes find yourself purging this card instead of playing it. But those situations don't happen very often, so definitely an A tier card. Next we have Bladestorm. And Bladestorm is sadly another C tier card. It just recently got a pretty nice buff with this. It's got +1 bleed now. It used to be 5, and it has the solo condition as well for the trigger +1. But the problem is that it does not fill any particular role that you're not going to be able to better fill with other easily acquired cards, and it does not excel in either of the two use cases, right, being AoE in multi-enemy fights or stacking bleed on one guy in a single target fight. 6 bleed is a pretty reasonable amount, but when you compare it to something like purging a bleeded out to get 3 for free, and while you're actually gaining an energy, it's better than free. That doesn't seem like such a great comparison anymore. Of course, you have to upgrade the bleeded out for that, and if you upgrade this thing, it's 8, which helps a bit, but most of the time, the reason you want AoE bleed is not because you want it to deal a lot of damage, but because you want it to do things like increase the block on your evades, allow you to activate clot effects, and that kind of thing, where all you really care about is having some relatively small amount of bleed. You could, like, theoretically put a stone on this, I guess, to take use of that plus trigger thing in a solo fight. Maybe that bails you out of an early elite or something, but it's probably not worth your stones, all things considered. And speaking of Bleed It Out, that's what's next. Bleed It Out is a B tier card. The most of the value from this card, the reason you're usually going to want it, is just because of this upgrade. Purge, apply bleed 3 to all enemies is a pretty insane line of text for a card to have. It's really, really strong. And of course, you can't forget the fact that once you no longer need that AoE bleed, right? If you've whittled the enemies down to 1, or if it's in a boss fight or something, and you've stacked up a bunch of bleed, then you can just play it. It expels itself. It's out of your deck. You don't have to worry about drawing it anymore. It's going to deal a pretty reasonable amount of damage when it triggers the bleed. It's a little expensive, too, to trigger the bleed of a single enemy with no extra effect isn't great, but that's why you just purge it all the other times. So, really nice bleed enabler, and it's got some extra utility. That's definitely enough for a B tier. Next is Bloodlust. And Bloodlust is actually a C tier card, if you ask me. This might be a little controversial. I know there are some people who, some skilled players who really like Bloodlust as sort of like this mid-game block card, but I'm not a very big fan of it. It is a swift block card, which is unique, and the block, well, I mean, it's not completely unique, obviously, there's Dueling Buckler, but this one actually spends your combo, right? And the clot effect for Overcharge is, it's okay, it's hard to get that much value out of this, but more often than not, you would just rather have a block card that's denser on its own, right? Like a shield wall or something like that is going to beat this out for me most of the time, because your combo is a very valuable resource in the early and mid game. It's at that point you probably don't have a huge number of sources of combo, and you probably have a relatively small number of cards that are very important to spend your combo on, like a Splatter or something. And if you spend your combo blocking with a Bloodlust, then all of a sudden you might realize you don't have it to actually deliver the killing blow and end the fight. So I'm very hesitant to spend combo on a card like this, and it's not optional, of course. You can't choose not to spend combo and just play this as 5 block for 1 energy, like you could just with your starting block. So it's just kind of awkward. It's a little hard to use, and I think I'd rather, in many cases, take a small hit here or there because I didn't fully block using a less powerful block card, just if it means that I can keep my combo up and actually get the kill. Maybe, you end up taking less damage in the long run doing stuff like that. I think that happens pretty often, so I give Bloodlust a C. After Bloodlust is Bloodthirst. This one fares a bit better. This is a B tier card. The damage output on this thing is pretty reasonable. 8 damage and upgrades to deal 11 damage. That's not bad. It's not exceptional. There are definitely cards that do better damage or have better additional uses, but this is more than adequate in the early and mid game to actually kill high health targets. And the clot effect is actually kind of pretty nice as well, right? 2 for 1 energy, or if you've upgraded it, clotting 4 to gain 2 energy. This thing can refund you a whole lot of energy, so you can set up a turn where, you spend a bunch of energy, like gaining combo and putting bleed on the guy to get the clot up. Then you just play the Bloodthirst, and you get a whole bunch of that energy back right away. Maybe that's what you need to play your block card, or it just sets you up for success on the next turn if the fight hasn't immediately ended after your Bloodthirst. It's a good card, just not top tier. Next we have Bloody Hell, the X-Cost Bleed Applier. This one is also B tier. If you compare it to other cards whose primary function is just putting a ton of bleed on a single target, it doesn't match up super favorably, but that's okay because as an X-Cost, one of the biggest benefits that this thing has is flexibility. You don't have to spend a set amount of energy on this thing. If you end up with less energy than you would need to play something like a Devastate, you'll still be able to make use of the Bloody Hell. And if you upgrade it to get it up to 7x bleed, then it actually does start to compare reasonably well with some of those other bleed applying cards. And also what's pretty important about this is that it doesn't spend or even interact with combo at all. So if you're generating silent shivs, for example, you would actually need to have some amount of combo preemptively in order to apply all that much bleed out of it. Bloody Hell doesn't care about that. So this thing is generally just about as good if you draw it early or late. It does not care when it shows up. It does not really care about what else is going on in terms of combo or anything like that. It's reliable. Good way to bulldoze your way through early elite fights and such, even if you do end up cutting it by the late game a lot of the time. Next, we've got one of the new cards, Bluff. And Bluff, I'm going to say, is also a B tier card. So this one is just a nice way to have some additional draw and discard in your deck. This is something that's pretty valuable on Hidden, since he can often easily generate Hidden Blades or Silent Shivs, and discarding those to turn them into real purgeable cards is quite valuable, right? Because when you draw a real card, then you discard the volatile Hidden Blade. That tends to be a pretty good exchange. And this one comes with a nice little bonus, some Rage. Plus, if you upgrade it, you get Overcharge as well. All of that's quite nice. Potentially getting 50% Rage on a zero-cost card is pretty valuable. The Overcharge is a small bonus. I don't think you really care to upgrade this thing most of the time. But, yeah, it's a good way to deal with garbage cards in hand. It's a good way to cycle through your deck and find your key cards. And just all around very nice. Up next, we have Building Steam. Man, this thing sure has changed. 2 cost previously, now it's all the way down to 0, and the upgrade has changed now for it to no longer expel. Significant improvements to the card over its previous form, and yet it's still going to get a C tier. This card is just not really relevant. It does so little. 2 damage to a random enemy is a very small amount. You know, ideas about upgrading it and then stacking up a whole bunch of Building Steams, while humorous, are ultimately probably a huge waste of your resources. The only great thing this has going for it is the fact that it is a 0-cost expel, assuming you haven't upgraded it, and just playing it as a card that you can just get rid of and thin out your deck and make all future deck cycles better will sometimes matter. Although even that is, it's not particularly, it's not even the best 0-cost expel in Hidden, right? I mean, what do you want me to say? It's Building Steam. Massively improved over its previous form, but still can't escape the C tier. Alright. Next, we have Dawn Raid. This one is definitely an A tier card for me. Even after having lost 25% rage, it's just a very efficient card. 25% rage for 2 Hidden Blades, or upgraded 75% for 2 Hidden Blades. 75% rage is still a lot of rage. This plays really nicely with the idea that you want to usually build up to this huge turn where you pop off and finish by spending your combo to end fights. This is just the perfect card for that kind of play style. I know that 3 cost is a bit expensive, but again, right, you don't need to be saving energy for future turns when you're ending fights with this thing. And it's still pretty good at ending fights. It's just a very strong card overall. Fits into most decks. Unless you're like super heavy on bleed, you'll be happy to have Dawn Raid. Next we have Draw Blood. We are going to be talking about the starter cards. And Draw Blood, actually, I would say is a B tier card. It's not that bad. The 4 damage is a little bit laughable, of course. But the Silent Shiv is really strong. Silent Shivs are very good, especially if they're upgraded. Although I still would not recommend you usually spend upgrade points on Draw Blood. Applying 2 bleed, and then having that swift and balanced keyword means that it interacts very favorably with a lot of your clock cards. So one of the most commonly seen examples, at least on my stream, is you have a Draw Blood and a Lick the Knife in hand. You can play, you have your 1 starting combo, of course, from your starter relic. So you just go Draw Blood, play the Silent Shiv. Immediately you can use the Clot effect of your Lick the Knife to rebound it, play it again, and you've got full combo, just like that. Super easy, very, very helpful in the early game. It's a card that you actually might consider keeping in your deck, even into the late game or even in the end game. I've won many runs with Draw Blood still in my deck. It's 2 attack cards in 1, which is great for all of the counting relics. It has some nice uses with cards that allow you to like rebound cards, like from Shadow or with like Clockwork. It's just nice. It's just a nice card. After Draw Blood, we have another starter card, Evade, and Evade is also a B tier card. As we were talking about earlier, it compares reasonably well even to a non-starter card like Anemia, getting up to 9 block maximum. It's quite good. And if you upgrade it, it's actually pretty significant. Again, though, probably not something you want to upgrade. You probably have better targets. But just because it's a starter card, you know, that's one of the things about Vault. The starter cards are actually pretty decent. And this is a good example of that, right? It does not do anything other than block, so you probably will end up cutting most of these as you enter the late game because you're going to find more efficient cards, cards with additional use cases that you can get benefit from, but overall, quite nice as a starting card. And after that, we have yet another block card, Evaluate. This one's also a B tier. So 2 energy for 10 block is nothing phenomenal, but it's an okay starting point, as long as whatever else the card does is nice. And the thing that this card does is quite nice, actually. You get 1 Hidden Blade if they're vulnerable, and you can get extra Hidden Blades if they're weak or slow as well. Pretty good effect. This helps you in situations where if you had to say, like, you know, consider, do I want to spend my energy on dealing damage, or do I want to full block by playing like a Tower Shield or something and bide my time? This is a card that helps you not need to make that decision, right? Go ahead and get your block from this thing, and also supplement a pretty decent amount of damage as well. Potentially up to 3 Hidden Blades, although realistically you're only getting 1 or 2 most of the time. That's still a pretty good deal. It definitely helps you close out fights earlier because you're wasting less time. And if you upgrade it to get 15 block, then you're pretty happy to play this card even if you're only getting 1 Hidden Blade, and sometimes even 0. 2 for 15 is pretty good. So, very nice card. Definitely a B tier. Next we have Exploit Vulnerability. Definitely an A tier for me. This card is awesome. So, Vulnerable is a really big deal in Vault. Vulnerable is generally the single most important thing that you can add into a deck in order to improve your kill potential. If you don't have Vulnerable and then you pick up any source of Vulnerable realistically, you put that in there, suddenly things are going to be going way better for you. And this isn't just any source of Vulnerable. This is one of the best sources of Vulnerable. 2 Vulnerable, lasting over multiple turns, that's really good. And you're getting bonus bleed as well, which, you know, not a ton of bleed, but it's potentially enough to boost up your evades, trigger those clot effects, that sort of thing. Quite handy. It interacts really favorably with the starting spell for the bleed deck. Applying Vulnerable and Weak means that you'll be getting quite a lot off of Exploit. You're going to get like 8 bleed off of this thing, which is great. The fact that they're going to be vulnerable when the bleed you've applied actually triggers means that it's even better than it seems already in that regard. If you upgrade it, then you're gaining 3 vulnerable by default, which is also really, really good if you play with adaptation, like I do, ensuring that you actually get multiple turns of vulnerable off this thing. And the extra value from weakness and slow, just a super duper nice card. Always happy to see this guy. Next up is First Blood. And this is not an A tier card. First Blood is going to be another C tier, sadly. This is really only useful in the very early game, if you ask me. So assuming that the target does not have that bleed, 1 mana deal 15 is pretty respectable in like the very early first couple of fights. You know, this is going to help you kill that first Blightwort, for example. Otherwise, you're applying 7 bleed for 1, which is not super impressive. Does not stack up very well against most other straight bleed appliers, right? Like we were just talking about Exploit Vulnerability. You can get similar amounts of bleed off of Exploit Vulnerability in addition to the fact you're getting vulnerable. And this isn't always applying bleed either, right? The volatility of this card makes it somewhat unreliable. You don't know what order you're going to draw your cards in. You don't know how much of a chance you'll have had to set up stacks of bleed already before you find the first blood. So maybe you really do need it to be actual damage so that you can kill the enemy before your threat stack triggers and end the fight. And oops, it's dealing bleed instead. Guess you have to take 20 damage, right? Like, nobody wants to be in a situation like that. I would usually cut this thing really quickly, so maybe if you see it in your opening card pack, you're okay with that. but even then, it is far from exceptional. Next, we have another starter card for the Throat. This one is also C tier. For the Throat, it's so awkward. I almost always cut at least one of these for whatever other Swift card I find, like right when the game starts. And usually the second one is not very far behind in terms of leaving my deck. 6 bleed per trigger is adequate, is what I can say about it. It will cause the enemy to bleed. That's as positive as I can get for this thing. It's not a particularly great amount of bleed. It does require you to have combo and then spend it on this thing. It's not immediate damage, which is what you want most in the early game, of course. The best thing you can do with this is if you draw it very early with some combo gain versus your initial elites. Like if your very first elite is a Corpse Mount or something, and you roll up and immediately draw your combo gain and your For the Throat, you'll be pretty happy. Otherwise, this thing is just so underwhelming. It's one of the weakest Swift attacks out there. So that is why it gets a C tier. Moving on, we have From Shadow. And From Shadow is quite good, actually. In fact, it's an A tier. So again, this one is very similar to Evaluate in that it's a 2 energy block 10, but the secondary effect of this one, instead of giving you Hidden Blades, can give you anything, sort of, right? Obviously, Rebound doesn't work on Volatile or Expel cards, but this is a pretty relevant effect a lot of the time. As mentioned previously, you can use it with something like a Draw Blood to get extra Silent Shivs, and that's pretty good. You can use it with other block cards, which kind of ends up making it a denser block card than it appears. You can use it with combo gain, so maybe if you haven't upgraded your Quickness yet, or you don't have the Clot trigger for your Lick the Knife, well, From Shadow kind of lets you pretend like those things are true anyway. Go ahead and just rebound the card. It's really, really useful. Has lots of small interactions that you'll notice as you play with it, and even though that opener effect can be a little awkward, it really sucks to draw into this thing in the middle of a turn when you can't trigger that opener. You can remedy that just by upgrading it. Upgrading it to have 12 block is nice, but that's not really the real reason you want to do it. Just dropping that opener condition is very powerful, lets you pick this thing up mid-turn, lets you get other opener effects, so something like your Ambush. And another thing that's worth noting about the From Shadow is that this effect that you gain carries over from turn to turn. It does not trigger until you actually play a card that could have rebounded. So you can even end your turn with a From Shadow if you've upgraded, right? And then next turn, the cards you draw into will be able to benefit from it. Super flexible, very powerful, solid A tier card. Moving on, we have Hemolysis. Hemolysis is a B tier card. This one is a pretty favorable comparison to Anemia that we were looking at earlier. Anemia was 2 energy for 9 block and 1 weak to all bleeding enemies. Hemolysis is 1 mana for 7 block and 2 stacks of weakness to only 1 bleeding enemy. That is a really good comparison. It's not that much less block. The fact that the weakness is targeted instead of AoE does not matter for a lot of fights because oftentimes you'll either be fighting a single target or because Anemia is only 1 stack of weakness. If you're fighting multiple enemies and the enemy does not happen to be attacking this turn, that weakness is wasted unless they already had stacks. So, you know, losing the 1 bleed to Clot, whereas Anemia doesn't lose the bleed, it just puts the weak on, that's also pretty negligible. It ends up just being a much more efficient card. The numbers on this thing are way better. The fact that you can theoretically get multiple turns of weakness on the key target is super duper nice. And this is almost always going to be better than one of your block cards that you currently have in the deck, at least until you get to the very late game. So, great B tier card. Next up, we've got Juggle, and this is also a B tier card. A lot of the stuff that I said about Bluff also applies to Juggle. This one actually costs energy, of course, but you're drawing and discarding 2, which is really nice, and it comes built in with a Hidden Blade. You can use one of those discards on that Hidden Blade if you want to have better energy value. You can use this to get rid of all the garbage cards, just like you could with Bluff. You can use it to filter for combo gain or rage to then scale up the value of the Hidden Blade that you've just generated. It's a pretty versatile, useful card. Definitely nice as a mastery pick a lot of the time, especially if you're starting with Voids. Just a great card all around. And continuing the train of B-tier cards, we have Lick the Knife. This one is the starting combo gain for the Bleed deck, and it is very efficient if you manage to upgrade it and get the Clot effect triggered. Spending 2 energy to gain 2 combo, which is going to max you out during the early turns before your combo cap increases. Then you can rebound it and purge it, which means effectively you've gained 2 combo for 1 energy. That's a great deal. That's some of the best combo gain out there, actually. And even before you've upgraded it, of course, if you can get that Clot to rebound it, it's still full combo in 1 card, whereas Quickness, for example, does require an upgrade in order to max out your combo by itself. Lick the Knife can do it right from the get-go, and as mentioned with Draw Blood, that's a really easy interaction to make it happen. So you're always going to be making great use of this early on with your Bleed runs, and usually it's worth upgrading these things and keeping them around all the way through the whole run, if you ask me. Just a really, really handy card. It is not the best combo gain out there, but it is pretty good. The reason it gets B tier instead of A tier is that it is a little finicky early on, which is when you need it the most, of course. If you draw it in the wrong order, then it might not be able to trigger that Clot effect, and only getting 1 combo for this thing is pretty rough. But still, pretty good overall. So, B tier for Lick the Knife. Next up, we have Light It Up. And I guess backup will just hang out with it too. Light It Up is going to be an A tier card. This is quite a bit of damage. 9 unupgraded is pretty good. And Overcharge 1 on this thing is also pretty good. Since it's a Swift card, of course, you'll be gaining a whole bunch of Overcharge at once. It's not conditional like the Bloodlust. I always mix up Bloodlust and Bloodthirst. This one's not conditional. You always get the Overcharge. It's actually pretty easy to generate quite a bit of energy from this thing. Right, if you draw it within the first 1 or 2 turns, you can pretty much always just play it, whether or not you've even found your combo gain. And then for the next 1 or 2 turns, you have extra energy. That's pretty good. You've dealt a decent chunk of damage to set up a kill on something. The fact that it expels so that it's then out of your deck and you're not going to draw it anymore is somewhat a downside in the very early game, but ends up being an upside towards the mid and late game. So I really like this card. Generally very happy when I find it early on, and it does often stay in the deck, even into the late game. Definitely an A tier for me. Main Gauss is going to be a B tier card. It's a pretty good block card. 1 for 7, again, is fine. Nothing exceptional, but it's fine. Gaining a Hidden Blade is pretty good. This one, I think, compares pretty well to Hemolysis. Hemolysis I was pretty positive about. This one, instead of the clotting for weakness, just has a simple gain 1 Hidden Blade. That's pretty nice. As mentioned with Evaluate, being able to have block and Hidden Blade generation at the same time is pretty nice overall. It's not hard to find a situation where that is exactly what you want to do. And if you upgrade this guy for 10 block, it's actually quite respectable. 1 for 10 is a pretty decent block card. I often will put a Yellowstone on these things as well in the early game, getting potentially 14 block for 1 energy. That's pretty good. It doesn't gain any, you know, extra value. It doesn't have multi-triggers or rebound or anything from that yellow stone, but making it just a really efficient way of blocking and then immediately afterwards pivoting into dealing damage. Pretty solid. So, good B tier. Open Up is next, and unfortunately this is another C tier card for me. It's just a little too situational. It's a little too finicky. There's on the literal first turn of early floor 1 fights, this is exceptional. If you could guarantee that you always drew this on turn 1 within like the first half of Act 1, or maybe the whole first floor, then it would actually be a really good card. But that is not the case, right? Even if you were going to greenstone this thing, you have no guarantee that you'll have a greenstone that early on. Most of the time you won't. And that's sort of like the intention with this thing, especially you look at the upgrade, it gets overcharge and expel. There's sort of supposed to be this idea that maybe you want to rig this card in some way. It's just simply not worth it, right? By the time you have the ability to reliably get this card in your opening hand, right, with either a greenstone or with, you know, like the discarded keys or something of that sort, you're going to be doing better things. 2 energy for 19 bleed is pretty good. That's actually quite a bit of value, but it's usually not going to be 2 energy for 19 bleed. Somewhat quickly, you'll get to a point where if you draw this thing in the bottom half of your deck, which is going to happen 50% of the time, it does nothing, right? It's literally not going to be gaining you any value whatsoever, because you'll have already put more than that much bleed on the target. And every point of bleed they already have shaves off the value of this thing, right? Like, you wouldn't play this if it was like 2 mana, apply 6 for sure, right? And it's not at all unreasonable to find yourself in that circumstance fairly early on in the game. So again, it kind of ends up being like First Blood. If you see this in your opening card pack, maybe you slot it in for a little bit, but it's not going to last very long in the deck. Okay, back to starter cards. We have Parry. Parry is also a B card. The obviously 1 for 5 is very mediocre, but Purge Block 2, that's actually quite strong. Always remind yourself, on any given turn of Vault, you're probably purging at least 1 or 2 cards, right? And why not gain some value from that, right? Most of the cards you purge don't do anything. Why not have a card that gives you some block when you purge it? This is really handy for cleaning up a stray singular or, 1 or 2 points of damage to maintain a perfect, when you might otherwise have to actually spend energy on one of your 1-cost block cards. Just being able to wipe that away so cleanly with Parry is really good. Again, you probably don't want to upgrade Parry, but if you do, Purge Block 4, that's actually quite respectable. It's not at all uncommon, I find, that I do keep 1 to 3 or even 4 parries in my deck well into the late game, purely because I know I'm going to be purging cards every turn, and I know that I'm going to be getting value out of parries every time I purge them, whereas most of the time I don't get any value from purging, so good B tier card. We also have Plan B, and big surprise, Plan B is in tier B. It is it's pretty decent. It is a pretty decent card. It's a swift attack that deals 4 damage and applies 3 bleed. That's okay. It's not really fantastic, but it's fine. And then it has this handy little upside as well, where if you don't have any combo, you get 5 block out of it. And that's really what bumps it from C tier to B tier, is the flexibility there to get the extra block. If you upgrade it, all the numbers go up a little bit, but I don't think you're realistically going to be upgrading this thing almost ever. As is, it's just a decent way to stick some bleed on someone, right? Like if you Plan B them while you have combo, odds are pretty good that the next time you see you lick the knife, you'll be able to clot it and get that rebound. The damage is okay. It helps soften things up so that the bleed can finish them off. And the blocking for 5 makes it a combo spender that you don't completely hate when you draw it alongside your other better combo spenders, right? So you draw your plan B and you draw your splatter. It's not that bad, right? You splatter one guy and kill him, and then you get some block from the plan B and put bleeding damage on another enemy. That's pretty solid. So that is why plan B gets a B tier. Next up, we have Quickness, and if I'm not mistaken, this is our first S tier card. Quickness is insane. This thing is so powerful. It's hard to believe you get 2 of these things for free in the Blade deck, right? I mean, it's just such a ridiculous card. So 1 energy for 1 combo is not particularly great. Block equal to combo is also, it's fine, it's not great, right? But the minute you upgrade this thing, it does become great. It becomes so great. It's 2 combo in 1 card, which, again, it sets you to your maximum during those first several turns. And it's gaining you quite a bit of block along the way as well. If you have 1 combo to start from your starting relic, you play this thing, you gain 2 block, you play it again, you gain 3 block. That's 5 block generated and 2 combo generated. And did we not forget, of course, that you're almost always going to put a Void Stone in this thing as well. Red and yellow are both excellent choices for this, but anything will do, honestly, besides green and black for the most part, right? Getting double overcharge triggers off of this is really nice. Putting a blue stone in there to cycle some cards out of your hand can be really nice to find the things that you want to be spending combo on, or finding your balanced cards, just pitching garbage cards out of the hand. Even Blackstone in this thing does actually do stuff, and that it lets you go from 0 to full combo during early turns, or it lets you go from 1 to 4 combo after the cap's increased. Again, generally wouldn't recommend that, but it's an option. The point is that this card is super duper strong. It's almost always the first thing you want to upgrade when you're starting a new run, and you get this in your deck either just because you picked the Blade deck or you found one early on, because you can find this card. It is just the best combo gain you're probably going to find, right? It is that simple. This thing rocks. Easy S tier. Moving on, we have Salt in the Wound, and it saddens me a bit to give this a B tier, because this is a card that I really like in concept. There's a lot of fun little things you can do with it. It's a really high clot cost, of course. 6 clot is an awful lot to ask, and getting those silent shivs, right, means that if they do have that 6 bleed, you can immediately reapply bleed with the silent shivs, and depending on how much combo you have, you'll be scaling up the bleed by some amount. So it can be good against single targets in that way. You could take a whole bunch of bleed off one guy and spread it out across a crowd in order to, buff and evade or something. You can use it to take excess bleed off an enemy that's already going to die and redistribute it somewhere relevant. A lot of little fun tricks and things like that you can do with it. But unfortunately, it comes with a large price tag. 2 energy, and you have to have that 6 bleed already applied. 6 is non-trivial to get. It's in the early game, it's going to be pretty hard to use this thing at all, and even in the mid game, oftentimes if you draw this too early, you simply will not have had a way to effectively put 6 bleed on someone. The Purge effect does a little bit to help it out, right? Just being able to get 1 turn of value off of something like, an Anemia or whatever. That's nice. The upgrade on this card definitely helps out a lot, cutting the clot all the way down to 3. If you do find yourself with an upgrade point that you're willing to spend on this thing, it's pretty good at this point. Interacts very, very favorably with a lot of the counting relics because it generates so many silent shivs all at once. But a lot of the time you will find that it just ends up being more awkward. I almost put this thing in C tier, but I like it too much for that. Maybe a little bit of personal bias coming in. But Salt in the Wound is a B tier for me. I almost always find myself trying to make this card work, and about half the time I would say it does. Next we have Sanguine Shell, and this one is a really strong A tier. I almost considered S tier for this one as well. It just barely missed the mark on that. 3 for 20 is adequate. That's pretty reasonable block. But of course you're triggering all bleed in addition, which is ridiculous. That is such a powerful effect that it really helps dealing with group fights if you're able to spread bleed out. It really helps even just in single target fights because those guys often hit really hard when they do hit. And as we mentioned, right, having offense and defense in the same card in those kind of situations helps a lot. This can be an enormous amount of offense. Bleed triggers can account for, like 100 damage or something. That's not that crazy, especially if you can apply vulnerable. Throwing on top of that the fact that this can interact with various block artifacts to double trigger itself, which then double triggers bleed. Ridiculous. It's got an insane upgrade. Purge block 5 is super duper strong, and you'd love to have a purge effect on an expel card like this because you're not going to want to play it every time you draw it. It's just an absolute banger of a card. Again, right, the only reason that this doesn't get S tier is specifically because there is a non-insignificant number of runs where you won't be relying on bleed damage much at all. And in those cases, it goes from insanely good to just very good. So, I don't know, maybe that does warrant an S tier, but it made a little more sense for me to put it in A. It's not quite an auto-include, I would say, but it's pretty close. Next we have Scattershot. Scattershot is another C tier card. Scattershot's a weird one. If you watch my stream, you will actually see me pick this as my mastery card sometimes, which might seem weird. Why would I pick this thing if I'm giving it a C tier? But the reason that I would do that is because this card does actually help in the very, very early games. It does help you handle things like the Hellhounds or the Greenhouse Corruption or whatever. And you might take a hit here or there, right? Depending on if you have like Original Sin and whatever other starting detriments are in your instability modifiers. This thing can help you during the first like 3 or 4 fights. But I will pretty much only take this thing if I think that all of the other things that I want are already accounted for with the pack. And also if Slick Strike is on cooldown. So like if I don't need Juggle or if I don't need Block to take like, from Shadow or something like that, maybe I'll grab a Scattershot as just sort of a filler choice. It'll help me out early on and then I'll get rid of it later. But it falls off fast, man. It falls off really fast. It's pretty expensive at 2 cost for what it does. Enemy health pools are going to get very large quickly to the point where Scattershot just doesn't really matter that much. It's a heavy card, right? So, like, there's heavy synergies, I guess, but those are few and far between and not particularly powerful even when you find them. Yeah, right? Like, if you compare it to just about any other card in terms of, like, dealing AoE damage, dealing AoE bleed, it just doesn't match up well. It simply does not. Next up, we have Scheme. Scheme is a bit of a weird one. I'm tentatively putting it in B tier. It's on the weaker side of B, though, that's for sure. Combo gain, pretty much all the combo gain cards are at least decent, because combo is just such a valuable resource. This is one of the weirdest ones, though. You have to wait a turn. How much combo you're actually gaining is variable. You don't really know when you put this into your deck exactly what it's going to be doing, and it has this strange upgrade that completely changes the way you use the card, discarding it for combo. That's actually a pretty powerful effect in the right deck, but not every deck has access to tons of discard, so it's a really weird one. Out of all the combo cards you're going to find along your run, you're probably hoping to see this one least often, but again, right, you do need to hit some sort of critical mass of combo gain, and this does help. It has some fun synergies where if you have the various things that can raise your combo cap, various relics, cards like agility, then it can suddenly become a huge amount of value, and that's kind of fun. Well, actually, I mean, it doesn't work with agility, of course, unless you're using it for the discard. It's a weird one. It's a weird combo gain card, but the fact that it is a combo gain card is enough to rescue it from C tier, so B it is. Next we have Sidestep, recently nerfed, gaining overcharge instead of immediate energy on the upgrade. But guess what? It is still an A tier card. This definitely would have been S tier beforehand, I would say. But it's still a great card. The block efficiency is very high on this thing. It's not that difficult to, just when you see this thing in your hand, plan your turn around it, purge all your cards before you start doing anything, and just get quite a bit of block out of this thing. It is really easy to get 6 or even 8 block from your sidesteps. And on top of that, you add in the fact that the overcharge is actually still pretty valuable, even though it's not as good as immediate energy. It's still very nice to have. It's a 0-cost card, so there are situations where you might be wanting to actually play this for overcharge instead of purge it for energy. It's just super flexible, great carrier of most stones, does anything that you would really want it to, honestly. Very, very good card. Next, we have a starter card again, Slash. And Slash is going to be a C tier card. This card is pretty underwhelming. It deals 6 damage, which is very low, actually, for a Swift card. And it has that little handy line of, gaining combos sometimes, but it's quite awkward to actually make use of that, since if you end your turn at 0, you'll gain 1 at the start of the next turn, right? So if you're sitting there at 0 combo, and the last Swift attack you have is just this Slash, it's like, well, if I play it for 6, I gain combo, but I was going to gain that combo anyway, so it really is just 1 for 6 at that point, and that's not a good deal. So this card, obviously you need it in the early game because you have to deal damage somehow, but you'll want to cut this thing pretty much as quickly as you can. It is a very weak card. On the other hand, Slick Strike is an incredibly strong card. This is an A tier. Slick Strike is pretty good damage at 8, right? We've seen some cards that deal similar amounts previously. We had Bloodthirst, and we had Light It Up at 9. 8 is a totally fine amount of damage. It's not bad. The Clot 1 block 4, though, really helps this card shine. This card can easily be all of the block you need in a turn while also dishing out a very significant amount of damage. It's a fantastic mastery pickup. If you upgrade it up to 11 damage again, that's quite good on an upgraded Swift attack. Blocking 6, super strong. Note that it is a block card, so it has some interesting synergies with the various block artifacts. It's just really, really efficient. Does lots of good stuff. Even if you're only triggering the Clot once or twice, that still ends up being high value. So definite A tier right there. Next is Snuff It Out. Snuff It Out kind of suffers the same fate as Backpedal. It is a C tier card. It's another way to sift things. It's guaranteed Silent Shiv generation. It can theoretically give you multiple Silent Shivs, but unless you're exactly sifting a Void, you usually don't want to sift expensive cards with this thing. Usually you want to be playing your expensive cards, and so it ends up being pretty hard to get much value out of this thing. If you just randomly bring it into a fight that is going to put some garbage cards in your deck, right? Like, what are you going to do? You're sifting a Bane or a Daze for 1 Silent Shiv. That's not that impressive. It just really is not. So even in the circumstances where, like, you're starting with Original Sin and you pick this thing up really early on, you can slot it into your deck, but you're still going to draw the Void before you draw the Snuff Out at least half of the time on average, right? Or you're going to draw them in the same hand. And then the Snuff Out just really stinks because now it's essentially another dead card in your hand alongside the Void that you drew. It's too hard to make use of it. If you upgrade it to Sift 2, that doesn't really solve any of the inherent issues it has. It at least lets you sift a different card besides, the expensive one and still gain the Silent Shiv, but that's just not that big of an upside. So, C tier for Snuff Out. on to Something Extra, if I can figure out how to spell it. Something Extra is a B tier card for me. This is a bit of a weird one. I think that this is a card that's very easy to overestimate when you're new to the game. It seems like it would be more powerful than it is, but that's not to say that it's bad. It still definitely has a place. The best use of this is just to maintain bleed uptime. If you get a Something Extra in play and you're doing just a reasonable amount of Hidden Blade generation and attacking per turn, it's quite easy to have permanent bleed uptime on one or even all of the targets in a fight. And that's really nice. There are quite a few things that care about bleed uptime. It helps you maintain values so that your clot effects will trigger more reliably. And it's not too terribly expensive at 2 cost. I will say the upgrade is kind of a trap a lot of the time in the early and mid game. Making this thing more expensive to get the extra bleed applied is not actually very useful most of the time until you get to the very late game. Because again, you really only want this for bleed uptime. Getting 2 stacks of bleed instead of 1 doesn't really help with it all that much most of the time. By the late game, you could say, well, I actually care about the damage the bleed is doing. This is going to help me scale up and kill single-target Vault Guardian fights. It's going to help me kill the Void and stuff. So, yeah, you know, at that point, you can upgrade it. But early on, probably don't bother with that. If you use this thing just as a way to keep up your bleed, you know, you put a greenstone in this or something, it's going to perform pretty well for you. And if this is supposed to be like, you know, your win condition or something, then, you know, you might be in a bit of trouble. You should probably look for something else. So, B tier for Something Extra. Next we have Splatter, and Splatter is going to be another S tier. S for Splatter. This card rocks. It is, if you're triggering the clot effect on this thing, it is the most damage per trigger out of all the Swift cards in the game. I guess you could consider In Cold Blood, but that's its own thing, so we're not going to think about that. In terms of raw numerical damage numbers that are not variable, this is the most. And it's by a somewhat significant margin for most of the comparisons. It's quite a step ahead of the rest, especially if you can upgrade this thing. 9 plus 6, and it's only Clot 1 to get that extra value. Insane. This thing just massacres the early game. It massacres the mid game, and it's usually doing pretty good numbers in the late game too. Super good card. Pretty much the best Swift attack that you can see early on. It outclasses all of the other ones, and you should use it. That's all I can say about this card. You should use it. Next up is Spring Forward. Spring Forward is going to be another B tier card. Right? It says gain combo. It's not complete trash, so that means it's B tier. Anything that gains combo is worth considering. The 8 damage is fine. It's not that bad. Discard to gain 1 Hidden Blade is a cute little effect to have access to, right? If you draw this thing and you already have your combo, you're probably not going to play it. Maybe you can discard it and get a Hidden Blade, right? Or maybe you upgrade it and then you can purge it in those situations to always get the Hidden Blade, and that's pretty decent. The fact that it's +1 combo is a bit weird since your starting combo gains, either Lick the Knife or Quickness, gain you 2, right? That means that you will often end up in a situation where if you draw this on its own, you're only getting the +1 combo, you're not maxing out, and that doesn't feel super great. And if you draw it alongside your other combo gainers, it's useless unless you can trigger that discard effect. So it's a bit awkward. If you have anything that increases your combo cap, then it becomes a lot better. I don't know, if you're having a ton of trouble upgrading your Lick the Knives and you can't rebound them or something, it's kind of hard to think of a situation in which this is like particularly good. But, you know, it's decent. The floor on your combo gaining cards is pretty high, so it gets a B tier. Next, we've got Summary Execution, and Summary Execution is a big ol' C. This card is just not very impressive. At 2 energy, it's a little expensive. 5 damage is not much. One Hidden Blade is going to add some damage to that, of course, but it depends on you having combo. And then it also has this clot effect, so you need to have combo to get value from the Hidden Blades. You need to have 2 energy to spend on this thing. You need to have clot in order to get extra triggers. It asks you to do quite a bit, and the reward is not particularly high. If you miss on any one of those things, if you don't have the clot, if you don't have the combo, if you are, if energy is tight on that turn, then the card is just basically worthless. So trying to line up all those things in order to get such a minimal payoff is not really worth it. C tier. Sustenance is next, though, and Sustenance is a great card. This is an A tier card. I love Sustenance. 5 block for 1 energy is not particularly great, like I said when I was talking about parry, but that's not the only thing it does, of course. 2 bleed to a random enemy is a little bit weird, but it's fine, it does still boost your evades, it does still help you get clots and stuff like that. And then it rebounds, and rebound is a really, really good thing to have on your card, because now all of a sudden it's this very flexible card where it's 1 for 5 or 2 for 10 block. It's going to apply the bleed twice, so if you get lucky, it can spread out the bleed and make your things like your evade even more powerful. Maybe it puts both bleed on the same target, and that helps you activate a higher cost clot. If you upgrade this guy, then both of those things become quite a bit better, of course, since you're doubling the value of the upgrade when you play the card twice. It's a really nice carrier of yellow stones. It's a decent carrier of blue stones. It's just a really handy card. Pretty much always a very significant upgrade over at least 1 block card in your deck. Next, we've got Thinning Out. Thinning Out is a weird one. I'm going with B for this guy. It definitely blows out of the water cards like Snuff out, right? Expelling 2 cards from your deck, and then expelling itself. This is going to thin your deck by 3 cards. It's a great way to get rid of garbage cards permanently, and it's a great way to just get rid of other cards in your deck that you put in there on purpose, but aren't as good as the rest of the stuff you have, right? You do always have to have 20 cards. Maybe your deck would operate better if it was 17 cards. Thinning Out lets you do that. In fact, you can even upgrade the Thinning Out to make it free, do something like, put a Blackstone in it, and now you can really get your deck down in size. That is not something that's very easy to do, generally speaking. So a really powerful option for some decks. But other times, you'll just be sitting there agonizing over, oh, what do I cut from my deck to put in this new thing that I just got? And it's really hard to actually fit only with 20 cards, and you want to go higher than that. And in those cases, Thinning Out is useless, of course, right? So because of that, it gets B tier. In the right circumstance, this thing is nutso, but those circumstances are, they're not the most commonplace. If you're just using this to handle like voids in the deck, after you get rid of the voids, then you're probably going to cut this thing. It's not the only way to handle that, of course. Things like Juggle will often do a better job because you can use them when the voids are in the hand, or if the voids are still in the deck, you can Juggle to draw into them and then pitch them, stuff like that. So for those reasons, it gets a B tier. Next up is 1,000 Cuts. 1,000 Cuts is unfortunately a C tier. This card is just a little too simple, I guess is what I would say. It does not really have any nuances to it. There's no like clever ways to use it really. It's just put some bleed on a guy. That's decent in the early game. It's not bad. But the fact that it's like this middling amount of bleed, it's not some really big amount like you could get with a Bloody Hell. It's not a little amount for cheap like you might get with, your Draw Blood to trigger a Clot effect or something. It's just kind of left in no man's land. It does not really help you out in any specific situations other than killing early elites if you're lucky enough to draw it at the start of the fight, is what I would say. Not a great card. The upgrade, again, just, puts the numbers up. It does not change anything about the card. Fundamentally, it's still doing the same thing, and that thing is not very good. Next, we have Underhanded Tactics, and this one's also a C tier card. Anybody who watches my stream knows what I think about this card. Oh, boy. It is 4 damage on a swift attack, which is pathetic. That's so weak. And part of that is supposed to be compensated for by the fact that, oh, but it applies weak and vulnerable, right? And it can benefit off of its own vulnerable, since each subsequent trigger after the first one is, getting the extra vulnerable damage, which pushes it up to 6 damage per trigger, right? Which is still not impressive. Need I point that out? 6 damage per trigger is not impressive either. The only thing that you really care about here is that you're potentially applying a very large amount of weak and vulnerable. Lots of weak and vuln on a single card for 1 mana, that's good, right? About half the time or more, that is not what Underhanded Tactics does, because every single enemy in the game takes turns off, right? And this thing is so unreliable, you can just hold it in your hand until the next turn, but guess what? Some enemies take multiple turns off in a row, and you're just losing resources every time you hold a card like this, right? It doesn't work well if you don't have your combo gain already, if you're only applying, like 1 or 2 stacks of weak and vuln, that's not super impressive. It's really, really awkward to try and use in tandem with your swift attack finishing cards, right? Like if you have something like a Splatter and an Underhanded Tactics, it's super awkward because you want to put the vulnerable on before you hit them with the Splatter, but then it's going to spend your combo, and then you have to gain back combo, and you got to sit there and be like, okay, well, I've got this much clot for my Splatter, and I have this much energy to spend, so if I do this and then gain this amount of combo, it's just more trouble than it's worth, man. It is just more trouble than it's worth. You'd be better off spending your energy on something that just, gains you rage, or something, anything else that applies vulnerable that isn't Underhanded Tactics is going to outclass it, right? Even if you're on the Bleed starter deck, you've got Blood Rush as your spell, applying stacks of Bleed. That's already so much better than Underhanded Tactics, right? It's just, oh, man. I don't like this card. I really don't. C tier. Moving into the uncommons, we've got Agility. Agility is not a C tier card. Agility is actually an A tier card. A for Agility. It's really nice. +1 combo for 1 energy. We were talking earlier about how, the +1 combo thing is a little awkward, but it's not awkward when your combo cap also goes up, because that means you will always be benefiting from the +1 combo on this thing, assuming that you spend it the same turn you play Agility, which is usually not that hard to do if you're maintaining the right balance of swift attacks in your deck to combo gaining cards. Then Agility is really beneficial. It's also really nice to note that even though the max combo increase is temporary, the combo that you gain will stick around, of course. If you, if you play this in a situation where you're not maxing out your combo, when the cap drops back down, you'll still have gained a real combo that sticks around. So that's very nice. I love to upgrade this thing, make it 0 cost, and put a Blackstone on it. It's a great way to scale up the damage potential of your finishing cards. So, that Splatter is going to be hitting even harder when you're adding 1 or 2 extra triggers on top of it with your Agility. Really, really nice card. I love it. And another really, really nice uncommon card that I love is Apprentice Blade. This one's also A tier. It's just very nice and efficient. Again, right, you're only getting 1 combo, which is a little awkward. It does cost 2 energy, but you're getting 2 Hidden Blades, or upgraded, you're getting 3 Hidden Blades. That's great. Combo and Hidden Blades, it's a match made in heaven. You really want both of these things. Even if you're not actually gaining combo, you can still gain some value out of this thing just by purely playing it for Hidden Blade generation. It's quite a bit of damage. And it pairs nicely with, stuff like Quickness or Lick the Knife, where you can rebound them, you can play this, you can purge that, and the Hidden Blades that you're gaining now have been a really big upside over something like the Spring Forward. Spring Forward is just dealing 8 damage, right? 8 damage is going to be outclassed by 2 or 3 Hidden Blades really easily. So very, very happy to see this card most of the time. Next up, we have Backup. And Backup is going to be B. B for Backup. This card is a bit of a strange one, getting 3 Volatile Lighted Ups. So this is a really great way to generate a lot of discard fodder. If you're cycling through your deck a lot, you play this thing for 0, suddenly you have 3 cards in your hand that you can just freely discard to turn them into real cards. Gain a lot of value that way. Very nice. It's quite difficult to get particular value out of the damage of actually playing the Lighted Up, since of course you're almost never going to have enough combo to actually trigger most of them multiple times. You can maybe get one triggered multiple times and then play the rest of them at 0 combo, or you might not even have the energy to play them all, who knows. But the damage is okay in that circumstance. If you play one Lighted Up for full combo and then the other two with no combo, that's still a reasonable amount of damage. That is not bad, right? It's still a lot better than just having one normal Lighted Up in your deck, because that card expels 2. This one just adds that Lighted Up to your hand, and you get these bonus extra Lighted Ups, right? Maybe you use them, maybe you don't. I don't know, but Lighted Up was an A tier card. This is a B tier card because it's an uncommon, so the bar is a little bit higher for uncommons. The upgrade on it, making it purge to gain a Lighted Up, is a bit funky. Again, if you have a lot of draw and discard, that could be a good option, since you can purge this to generate free discard fodder. Or theoretically, you could just keep playing the Lighted Ups. I don't know why you would do that, but I guess you could. It's an option. Yeah, not a bad card to be sure, but not an exceptional card. Moving on, we have Blender. And Blender is actually going to be an S tier card. This thing is simply ridiculous. 6 bleed to all enemies, and it's swift. That's just great. That's just great. That is a lot of bleed in your AoE fights. It expels itself after you use it, which is often an upside, right? Like you play this once at full combo, and you never need to worry about things like clot effects or bleed up time. Pretty much again for the rest of the fight. Very, very, very nice. You also have the option, of course, to upgrade it if you don't want it to expel. You know, sometimes that's worth doing. Usually it's not, I would say. But in general, this is probably going to be better in your deck than one of your Swift cards currently. You look at this thing and you look at For the Throat, and it is just a crying shame, man, that For the Throat is so much worse than this thing. Very, very good card. Next up, we have Blood Siphon. It's a bit of a weird one, but it gets a B. Mostly just for the Purge Block 4 effect. That's pretty good to have on a card by default. That's nice. Removing the target's bleed to gain that much block is very difficult to make use of well, because usually, of course, you need that bleed to actually kill. This is at its best where a bleed trigger put them very, very close to death without actually finishing them off. And then you can, like, Blood Siphon the bleed away and finish them off with some sort of immediate damage. That's pretty situational. Otherwise, of course, you know, like, this will prevent you from dying sometimes, but only in the short term. Getting rid of all the bleed on the enemy, if you needed to do that to survive, your odds for the rest of the fight are not looking super great, let me tell you. If you upgrade it, it triggers their bleed first, and that makes it a lot better, although it's still really wonky. The purge block is unchanged, and you're going to be purging this thing a lot more often than you play it, so questionable. It is a really funny and potentially powerful interaction with Congeal, although it's not super easy to find both of those cards. They're two uncommons, and then also have a deck that can support them. So it's a bit weird, but the Purge effect definitely saves it from the gutters of C tier here. Purge for block 4 is really nice on an unupgraded card. Next up, we've got Cease Exertion, and it gets a C because in general, the more you play this game, I think the more you'll find that slow is just really hard to actually make effective use of. As surprising as it might seem. It seems like it would be such a powerful defensive effect, but it kind of isn't. A lot of enemies only have one frenzy. The way that slow scales means that stacking additional slow on could either be super relevant or not very relevant at all, right? Like if an enemy is attacking you with 5 frenzy or something, extra stacks of slow are super valuable. If an enemy only has 2 frenzy, extra stacks of slow are just kind of eh. Especially if you're playing with adaptation on, like I usually do. Something like this where, you know, maybe you get a second stack of slow. That's actually a pretty low value effect. You take into account the fact that enemies skip turns a lot of the time as well, right? It's a trap. A lot of the time it is just a trap. Blind Spot really hurts this as well. Not knowing what enemy you're going to go into, how much frenzy they may or may not have. It's just really hard to find a way to make use of this thing. The upgrade just adds more slow onto it, which, you know, not the problem that this thing has. Its problem is not that it doesn't apply enough slow. Its problem is that this sort of slow application with no other benefits is just not super valuable. So, C for Cease Exertion. Next card is another favorite of mine, Congeal. Congeal is going to get a B tier. This is a super weird card with a potentially very significant effect. Being able to... I mean, I keep bringing it up, right? But having those sort of dual-moded offense and defense cards is quite good. And this turns all of your other block cards into those kind of dual-moded cards. For one turn, you know, you can upgrade it so that it doesn't expel. You can just put a Blackstone in it and put 2 stacks on one guy, and that's really good. It makes all of your chunky block cards, things like your Sanguine Shell, super duper good. It works really well with something like Slick Strike. It works really well with something like Dueling Buckler. It has lots of little things too, even purging your parries, gaining random excess block from a Quickness that you were just playing to gain combo. So many ways to take advantage of this effect. Just really, really useful. Right? You can, and taking into account not only the fact that you can just play your block cards as is, but anytime you're playing block cards for excess block, of course, you're not losing as much value, whereas, like, if you have, you know, 10 threat on the stack and you play a card that blocks 20, that feels a lot better with Congeal down versus if you didn't. And if there's no threat on the stack, you can just purely go offense if you drew a hand that would otherwise be bad. You know, run out all those block cards. It's very fun, but it does end up being kind of situational. Not every deck wants this thing for sure, but I think that the upsides it has are enough to make it at least a B tier card. Next we have Dagger World. Dagger World is absolutely an A tier. This thing is kind of crazy. If you look at it just purely in terms of the numbers and line it up with the other cards, it's a little overtuned, I want to say. It's really, really strong. So much block from this thing, just at the absolute baseline. You think about all the decks that can generate a bunch of Hidden Blades and Silent Shivs, it just only gets better. Obviously, draw power is really good in Vault in general, and this thing just scales right up with that. It's got an incredible upgrade, adding a Silent Shiv to hand before it counts for block. That's great. What can I say? I love this card. It's really, really good. It's probably better than one of your blocks. You should probably be playing it. Next, we've got one of the new cards again, Devastate. This is a fun one. I'm going to give it a B. It applies vulnerable and weak in very significant quantities. Bleed as well, right? Like, that's quite a bit. Quite a lot of stuff happening here. Just contingent, of course, upon the fact that you already need to have a little bit of vuln and weak, and you will definitely not always have those. So in that case, 3 for 18 is not great. I talked a lot of crap about 1,000 cuts, and this scales up accordingly, right? It's an extra 1 energy, you're getting an extra 6 bleed. So that's not a great comparison. You don't really want to be playing this thing just for bleed, but it's at least there as an option, right? If all else fails, this is a great way to make sure that one particular thing is going to be bleeding for probably the rest of the fight. It's not super difficult on the bleed starter deck if you just time your spell well to get the extra vuln and weak, and if you have, it works well with, you know, like crippling potions and stuff like that. Works well with some of the artifacts that apply debuffs. I suppose you could theoretically use this with, like, Underhanded Tactics too, right? Like, it's got a lot of support for what it does. Not that hard to find them. Pretty good card. Next we have Dueling Buckler, and this shouldn't surprise anybody. This thing is S tier, right? Like, this is one of the most obviously S tier cards out there. It is just wildly strong. 0 cost, 3 block per combo you have, plus the 3 default. It upgrades to 5. So much defense at such a small cost. You put a Blackstone in this thing, and you feel invincible. Like, nothing can kill you while you have a Blackstone Dueling Buckler. You will, on rare occasion, find yourself in a circumstance where you don't actually have the combo for this thing, but it's not very frequent. Just a ridiculous card. One of the best defensive cards in the entire game. Easy S tier. Next we have Flaying Flesh. Flaying Flesh is a card that I'm going to give B tier to. This one is, it's alright. You know, I mean, 11 damage on a Swift card is not that bad. Obviously this one costs 2, but you're getting that extra damage per trigger every time. You don't have to, like, keep paying extra energy, of course. And 4 bleed on top of that, you know, that's not bad, right? You upgrade it, the damage numbers look a little bit better. It helps a bit with bleed uptime. It helps a bit with immediate damage. It's a little awkward, usually, I would say, to have a deck that, like, really cares about making use of all of those effects. But it's not bad. It might well be better than one of your other Swift cards, you know? Like, I'd rather have something like this over a For the Throat, for sure. But not in the upper echelons, to say the least. Next up is Focus. Focus is a bit of a strange one. We're gonna give it a B tier. It's a 0, or it's an energy positive card, right? There aren't a lot of cards in Vault that will generate you more energy than they cost when you play them. And that's something you want sometimes, right? This is also an Expel card, so you can get a thinner deck that way, which is nice. But you do have to jump through some hoops to get the energy, and it's only +1, so not super impressive in that regard. The upgrade, just making it lose Expel, again, a little bit weird. Usually you'd rather Expel this thing, I think. Just kind of awkward. I'm not usually thrilled to find this thing, but it does make for pretty decent filler, so that's why it gets a B tier. Next we have Fresh Steel. This one is also a B tier. It generates a whole crap ton of hidden blades, even more if you upgrade it. But the fact that you have to discard your entire hand makes it difficult to really go crazy with this thing. You know, you can't assemble any super disgusting combos with it because you're gonna lose all of the stuff in hand that could, like, you know, if you have like a swift attack with a bluestone on it or something, you can't generate a bunch of hidden blades and then discard them after the fact, right? It's difficult to use this on a turn where you have like significant threat on the stack. If you've drawn a buff that you want to play, it's difficult to get the buff in play and get good value out of Fresh Steel. But you know, it's far from impossible. There's definitely plenty of situations where you would really like to just turn your entire hand into pretty efficient damage, plus a bonus hidden blade, a little cherry on top, right? Why not? So B tier for Fresh Steel. Next is Grape Shot. Grape Shot is also a B tier. This card is a powerhouse in the early game. Absolutely clobbers the first half of floor 1. All by itself. You just play it and everything dies. Great fun. Purging to Sift is really nice as well. This is a very good way to handle those voids early on. It's a good way to deal with the fact that you might not want to play this if there's a whole bunch of enemies on the field and it's not going to kill them all, right? Then you wouldn't want to rely on the random damage of it, and so you can just purge it instead and get some value. Really funny with Once More with, but it doesn't really have any synergies to speak of besides that, right? It does not interact with combo. It's an ability, so it does not interact with rage. you're going to find that the damage it deals is less and less impressive, and pretty much always you should cut this thing by floor 2. But until then, it's good enough that it definitely warrants at least a B tier here. And next we have one more B tier as well, Gutted. Gutted is a pretty simple card. It's, 2 cost to trigger target's bleed, just like Bleed It Out from earlier, but then it has that really nice slay effect to transfer the bleed. That's quite good. That definitely helps out in multi-enemy fights. And if you upgrade it, it only costs 1, which is a really nice deal. Upgrades that decrease cost are not super easy to come by. So if you're relying on a lot of bleed triggers, an upgraded Gutted will definitely help your deck out. But again, similar to with like Sanguine Shell, you're not always doing bleed stuff, so that kind of knocks it down a decent amount. Ends up in B tier. Moving on, we have Hamstring. Hamstring is a C tier. This suffers from a lot of the same problems as Ceaseless. It's just a bunch of slow on a card. It has bleed and block as well, although they're not in very impressive numbers. If you upgrade it, of course, you get delay block additionally. But again, right, not an impressive amount, really, given that you're spending your combo on this. It's often very hard to justify doing that. Combo is such a valuable resource, right? And this thing is just like a lot of weird, maybe defense that you're getting from it, right? How often are you going to be able to take advantage of both block and delay block gained at the same time? How often are you going to be able to take advantage of all the slow all at once? The bleed is not like super great. It's just not a very good card, honestly. C tier. Alright. Next is Hide. Hide I have put into the B tier as well. This one kind of in the same situation as Blood Siphon, where the Purge block effect saves it. It's such an awkward, weird card, The fact that your threat stack doesn't trigger just, kicks the problem down the line, and if you're not able to block it on the turn that you draw Hide, next turn there's probably going to be even more, so I don't know, you better have like an ice wall or something, right? Because if you couldn't handle it on the first turn, on the next turn it's going to be even more. So you'd better be ending the fight, or you'd better have some insano block card, right? Which usually you're not going to find yourself in a situation where your deck looks like that, and the enemy's attacked in this way, and you've drawn the Hide at the right time. That just doesn't end up happening super often. But Purge Delay Block 3 is really good, so, there is that. And upgrading it to get up to 6, that's a lot of delay block. That's pretty strong. Would you upgrade this thing just to get that? Probably not most of the time. So usually I don't end up playing this, but it has its uses, I'm not quite willing to put it into C tier, but it's on thin ice. Next up is Jab, and again, this probably doesn't surprise anyone, but it is an S tier card. This one was nerfed to go to 2 energy instead of 1 recently. It was absolutely an S tier card before, and it turns out that this nerf was not enough to drop it out of S tier. It's still insane. It is still an enormous amount of card draw. You can put a bluestone on it and get even more, for ridiculous cycling. You can put a redstone on it to gain a whole bunch of rage, and you're probably drawing into combo gain and your other swift attacks. It just does everything you would want it to do, right? It's reasonable damage, it's a bunch of draw, it triggers things repeatedly, all your void stones and stuff. It's good. It's really good. That is all there is to say about Jab. Next, we've got Lacerations, and Lacerations is a C tier card. This one, again, I think this one is very similar to something extra. It is pretty much only useful for ensuring bleed uptime. The scaling effect of this is not very relevant. It would be almost the same card if it just says that the bleed didn't trick down, or, excuse me, that the bleed just, didn't tick down, right? going -1 when it ticks down and +2. If it just +1'd it, then it would pretty much be the same. You're not really going to get any significant damage out of this thing. The only like real benefit that it has going for it is that it's 1 cost, and you can rig it with an upgrade, I guess, that maybe matters to you. But again, right, it's an uncommon, so the bar is a little bit higher for it, and with something extra, you actually can get significant amounts of bleed out of it by the late game. Maybe you're generating a whole bunch of hidden blades, and now all of a sudden it's actually adding a lot of bleed, but Lacerations will never add a lot of bleed. It will only ever just keep your bleed uptime, and it doesn't even do that against the Void because he ticks bleed down faster than Lacerations, but you shouldn't really be relying on Lacerations at that point. You should be applying a lot more bleed, so it just ends up being too marginal an effect, not enough utility. That is a C tier. Next up is Leading Edge, and Leading Edge is a low B tier, is what I'm going to say. Low B tier. The damage it deals is fine. 13 on an opener, 2 hidden blades. That's a pretty decent amount of damage. The downside, of course, just that you will definitely not always get that opener effect. Lots of things draw you into this in the middle of a turn, and then it feels very sad spending 2 energy for 13 damage. That is not a good deal. It competes with stuff like your From Shadow, like your Bluff. It has this unfortunate problem where the upgrade puts a lot of value into that opener effect. 2 for 17, still not super great. So, you know, the upgrade doesn't really alleviate its problems. I vaguely considered putting it in C tier, but I do think it's a little bit better than that, especially if you can pick it up early on. It's quite good in the early fights when you're not going to have as many opener effects, and it's just going to be a lot of raw damage. So, not the most impressive thing out there, but I will at least give it B. Next up we have Mithril Blades, and Mithril Blades is an A tier. This card is really good. Getting an extra trigger on all of your blades and shivs represents a lot of damage if you have rage, represents a lot of damage if you have vulnerable. If you upgrade it, then you're getting +2 triggers, although the cost does increase. That's still very significant. Getting multiple stacks of Mithril Blades down, or upgraded Mithril Blades, will really catapult your damage up there if you can generate lots of hidden blades and silent shivs. And even if you're only generating like a modest amount, it's still going to impress you, I think you'll find, in terms of damage. I really like this card a lot. I've won plenty of runs off the back of this thing alone, with no other real win condition in sight. So I have to give it an A tier. Next we have Jab's younger brother, Nick, and unsurprisingly, Nick is also an S tier. It costs 0, which is ridiculous. It applies an okay amount of bleed. You know, that's not super impressive, but it's something. And you're drawing a bunch of cards, which is great. You know, the upgrade actually makes it apply a crap ton of bleed, although it's questionable how valuable that is as an upgrade. One way or another, though, this is just going to cycle you through your deck super fast. It's going to get you to your cards that you want to play early on, like your buffs to get set up. It's going to get you back to combo gain, so that you can play other Swift cards. It's going to really easily allow you to take advantage of clot effects and bleed triggers. Just an all-around excellent card, right? Probably weaker than Jab at this point, although they're both still very, very powerful. So definitely an S tier. Next we have Opportunist. Opportunist is an A tier card. This is Swift AoE, which is unique and quite powerful. 9 damage to everyone if they're bleeding is a lot. You know, you add in your rage and, you know, your vulnerable or whatever you have there, and this is going to be a lot of damage. This is going to end a lot of fights as soon as you play it, especially if you upgrade it. Getting all the way up to 12 damage base to everybody is really, really nice. This is a hallway fight solver for sure. This is a great way to pick off minions in boss fights so that you don't need to worry about, you know, the piglets or whatever that are causing you trouble, or the totems in, you know, the Swamp Witch fight or something like that. Just don't even worry about them. Opportunist has got your back. Very strong card. Fills a unique role. Well worth playing most of the time. Next up is the Oversized Backpack, and this one's an A tier as well. It's almost an auto-include, but not quite, because it does, you know, give you a lot of cards. It does refund its energy in terms of, you know, you can purge cards that you've drawn to get the energy back. You can gain energy when you draw an attack, even upgrading to gain 2 energy. So, like, it's a lot of resources that it's giving you. Although that draw lock does matter quite a bit on Hidden. It's notably very bad with any draw and discard effects, which you might draw off of the Oversized Backpack. You don't draw anymore, but you still have to discard, so that really stinks. If you've ever forgotten about that and played a swift attack with a blue stone in it after backpacking, you know the pain that I'm describing. But it's not that hard to play around the restriction of this thing. You won't put it in your deck maybe if you are relying on something like a jab with a blue stone in it or something like that, right? Because you really don't want to draw into that off backpack. But for most decks, you can just slap this thing in there and it's just all value. Even if you don't have very many attacks, even if you don't always gain the energy back, it's still really good. So that's an A tier for sure. Next up, we've got Phantom Walk. Phantom Walk is also an A tier card. This card is a huge number of Hidden Blades, all in itself. The fact that you're discarding one, you can of course discard the Hidden Blades you're generating in order to alter the energy efficiency of this thing. If you upgrade it, it loses inert, and then you can put something crazy like a red stone in it, or a blue stone to discard more of the Hidden Blades maybe if you wanted and really cycle through your deck. It is sort of comparable, I guess, to Dawn Raid in terms of the fact that it just generates a whole bunch of Hidden Blades, and that's a very good thing to be able to do. You know, it doesn't have Rage by default, but if you have, like, anything else that's giving you Rage or buffing your damage in any way, right, like Mithril Blades, like we were just talking about, then it's going to be a lot of damage. The fact that the damage is split up into these individual little Hidden Blades as well is great because it means you can allocate it very efficiently. You're not going to be like overkilling one thing by a bunch. You can split it up almost exactly as you want to be very, very efficient with your damage. It is a great card. And we actually have a couple more A tiers coming up here because next we have Response. This one's also an A tier. It maybe could be an S tier, but now that the upgrade increases the cost to 4, you know, that's actually pretty hard to get into play. So we're leaving it just an A tier for now, but man, what a powerful effect. Gaining 1 or 2 Hidden Blades for each enemy planning an attack every single turn. That could be so many Hidden Blades. You know, I was praising Phantom Walk for all the Hidden Blade generation it did, but you have to keep playing that. You have to discard cards from hand. You have to, you know, jump through hoops. Response, you just play it once, and then you will just get a bunch of Hidden Blades somewhat randomly for the rest of the fight, but it's fine. It's really not that bad that you don't know if the enemy's attacking or not, because it doesn't inform your decision-making in any way. It's not like RNG that you need to care about. You either just get the Hidden Blades or you don't, and when you get the Hidden Blades, you can often use them to kill the enemy that is attacking, and so it doesn't matter that they were attacking. Notably, of course, versus the Void, it always triggers once per turn, because one of the 2 minions is always attacking, and the Void never attacks until they're dead, and then it attacks every turn. So it's reliable in those instances. It's just a great card. Very, very, very powerful card. And coming up next, we have yet another A-tier card, Rip and Tear. This is a phenomenal source of vulnerable and a pretty good source of bleed as well. Packaging all of this onto a Swift card, being able to put down fat stacks of vulnerable is really appreciated. It's pretty great to have your first combo spend be on a Rip and Tear, and then you just rebuild combo and throw out whatever other Swift attack you have, and the damage is massively amplified. They're taking bleed triggers while they're vulnerable, so it has some nice self-synergy there. If you upgrade it, you're getting 8 bleed, which is a very good deal. 8 bleed per trigger, that's nice. Just a really, really good vulnerable source. After that, we have Scent of Blood, which is also A tier. Almost entirely just for this Purge effect. Purge gain a Silent Shiv, that is really good. That is great. You know, for as nice as I was saying it is to be able to just go like Draw Blood, Silent Shiv into Lick the Knife or something like that, what if you cut out the fact that you had to play a 1-cost deal 4? Just purge your scent of blood. Boom, there's your Silent Shiv. Now you can rebound your Lick the Knife. Ridiculous. Super duper strong. It pulls double duty. It's also potentially a huge rage gainer towards the late game. You can get upgraded Silent Shivs off of it, which changes the math on some of those cloud effects if you upgrade it, which is really, really good as well. It is a very powerful card. Almost always worth running. Not 100% of the time, so it doesn't quite get to be S tier, but especially in the early game, this thing is great. And finally, we are going to exit the A tier strike with Sleight of Hand. Sleight of Hand is another one of my favorite cards, but it has to be B tier because this thing, so it falls into the category. There's several buffs that basically just say, you know, when you play your hidden blades, you get a little bit of benefit, right? Sleight of Hand, Building Steam, Mithril Blades, something extra, right? They all have their little idiosyncrasies in ways where they're a little bit better sometimes and a little bit worse other times and stuff. But, like, fundamentally, they're doing pretty similar things. This one is not exceptional. If you manage to upgrade it, 5 damage added on top of each hidden blade is pretty good. It does add up, but it is random, which isn't super great. It's expensive to get into play, but not, like, too expensive. There are definitely times when you would prefer this over Mithril Blades, but I do think Mithril Blades tends to be stronger more often. So, you know, just looking at it that way, I guess you can see why I would put it in B tier. Maybe I could be convinced to bump it up to A tier, though. It is certainly not a bad card. Next we have Slice and Twain. This is another B tier. 2 energy for 20 damage is not that bad. That's pretty okay. And then you're also getting 8 bleed to the enemies that you did not target. So anytime you're in a multi-enemy fight, that's pretty good. That is nice value. 16 total bleed and 20 damage for 2 energy. That's a great deal. Of course, in single target fights, it's not very impressive. And, you know, the upgrade it's alright. Nothing really super crazy. Doesn't change anything about how the card actually works. It has some situations where it's very strong, and it has some situations where it's not very strong. This thing will really help carry you through the early game if you get it out of, like, your pack at the start or something like that. So it's an okay B tier card. Next up, we have That'll Sting. That'll Sting, sadly, gets C tier for me. This is another card that I actually do like a lot in theory, but in practice, I find that I don't actually end up getting very much value out of it. 2 energy for 8 bleed and 8 damage is, you know, I mean, that's not bad. It's not particularly impressive. You probably have better things to be doing, right? We were just looking at a card that for 2 energy was 20 damage and 8 bleed to 2 targets, right? You know, that had its own issues, but still. If you're not actually gaining, you know, a bunch of rage or some vulnerable or something for the That'll Sting, then you're not going to be very impressed. If you can, you know, really stack up the rage and stuff, then it starts to look a lot better, but at that point, you know, when you have a whole bunch of rage, all of your damage cards are looking pretty good. Why go for this one in particular that's so not good when you don't have all that rage? I generally find that this thing is more trouble than it's worth, and that you would be better served just leaving it in the backpack. Sorry, That'll Sting. I do really like you. You're just not quite up to snuff. Next up we have Thief's Code. And Thief's Code is awesome. This is an A tier card for sure. Being able to draw and discard 1 every turn is really, really beneficial. It cycles through your deck faster to find the cards you need. It helps you avoid the negative effects of afflictions, like the ones that the Void's minions give you during the final boss fight, so that's really good. It's just a very simple and powerful effect. It upgrades to get rigged, which is great because you very frequently do want to rig this card. Yeah, not much else to say about it. You'd be hard pressed to find a deck that wouldn't mind a copy of Thief's Code. Next up, we've got Trigger Phrase. Trigger Phrase, I'm going to put in the B tier. This one's a bit awkward. It falls into the category of cards which want you to spend and then regain your combo mid-turn, right? It's a swift card that gives you Hidden Blades. You want to have combo to use those Hidden Blades, especially because they're boosted up by Rage now. So you do need to have a fairly dense combo, or a large combo gain package in your deck, not a dense one. You want to have multiple cards that gain combo rather than like one card that just gains it all to you if you want to reliably line this up. Upgrading to 0 is pretty nice though. Helps you actually play out those combo gainers after you've used this. If the stars align and you manage to go like, Trigger Phrase with a bunch of combo, gain a bunch of combo back, throw out all the Hidden Blades, and then play a swift attack to cap it all off, that's going to look really impressive. It's going to be a ton of damage. It's going to end a lot of fights for you. But that's not going to happen super often, and if you don't have any means of regaining combo, this is not an impressive card. In theory, like, you might have some sort of non-swift card that deals a lot of damage, right? Like maybe you have an aggressive attack or something, and it can do all right in those cases, but that's generally not how your hidden decks are going to go. Usually your damage is coming from either swift attacks, which need the combo, or from bleed, which doesn't care about rage. So for that reason, it gets a B tier. Next, we get another one of the new cards, Undercut. Undercut is also going to be B tier. It's free in terms of energy, so that's really good, and it applies both weak and vulnerable, so that's nice. We have a variety of cards that care about having multiple debuffs like that, right? It's good with Devastate, it's good with Evaluate, it's good with an upgraded Exploit vulnerability. All of that's quite nice and all. What's not super nice is that the thing that you really care about with this is vulnerable. And the vulnerable is locked behind a clot, and it's a fairly expensive clot. 4 is a decent amount to be asking for on your vulnerable applier. It's pretty important that your vulnerable appliers are reliable, because oftentimes that's what's going to make the difference between a clean kill and a fight where you take, 10, 15, 20 damage. So because of that, it suffers a little bit, has to be bumped into a B tier. If the clot was lower, I would probably consider this an A tier card. The upgrade does not even lower the clot, it just increases the vulnerable stacks, so you're always going to have to contend with that nasty clot 4. No way around it. It's very unfortunate if you draw this thing early on, especially if you play with Adaptation. The early turns are nice normally because you can freely put out stacks of vulnerable and not need to worry about it falling off extra fast, but with Undercut you probably don't have that clot 4 on the, the first turn, or maybe even the second turn. So ends up in B tier, but it's still pretty solid. Anything that says vulnerable on it is probably okay. Probably. Next up, we've got another B tier card. It is Unrelenting. Unrelenting is fine, The damage it deals is not super impressive, but the combo it gains is quite good. 2 combo on 1 card is very nice, maxing out your combo on the early turns. It's just a nice, effective way to do that. The damage does help you out in the really early game. By the late game, you're kind of going to be ignoring that. Not much to say about this one. It's pretty simple in its functionality. If you don't need the extra combo gain, don't bother with it. If you do, then yeah, sure, go for it. It's a good one. And now, finally, we move into the rares. We're almost done here. First one is Accelerate, and it is a B tier. It's a B tier card for sure. It is a very strange one, right? It's a swift card that gives you celerities. Celerities being cards that just max out your combo gain. So it's really weird, right? Because how much combo is an Accelerate worth, right? It costs you combo up front, but then it gains you combo later. All the celerities go into the deck, so you might draw multiples of them, and then, you don't need 2 celerities usually unless you have, like, a really crazy hand. It's kind of tough to give this, like, a general value level. Some decks would really love this, like if you're going absolutely crazy cycling with, Jab and Bluestone Slick Strike and all sorts of stuff like that, then you'd probably really like an Accelerate, because that would let you spend and regain your combo repeatedly, cheaply, while you're just cycling through your deck, gaining lots of value. But a lot of the time, it's actually very awkward to make use of all those celerities, and you really only want to play the Accelerate for like 2 combo or 1 combo even, just so that you're getting just a handful of celerities. You know, 1 or 2 celerities actually is often correct. So very, very weird card. Kind of hard to use sometimes, but still powerful. So it gets a B tier. The next rare is also a B tier. It's Blades Upon Blades. And yeah, this one, again, it's kind of like Trigger Phrase, right? It's a Swift card that gives you hidden blades. So you do want to be able to regain your combo. This one deals a pretty respectable amount of damage, though. 9 damage is not bad. So it doesn't have the same issue of Trigger Phrase, where if Trigger Phrase is like, you know, one of your only damage cards in hand, then it's not very impressive. If Blades Upon Blades is one of your only damage cards in hand, it's not that bad. You know, dealing 9 and then even having to play the Hidden Blades with no combo at all is okay. Not great, but it's okay. But, you know, if you do have the ability to regain combo, you slap a redstone in this thing or something, and that's not bad. The next one we have is yet another B tier, and it is Ceaseless. Ceaseless is a very... this is a card that fluctuates in value from deck to deck a lot. You will often have decks where you just don't want this at all because you don't spend combo very frequently, or you have really good cards that regain your combo and this just doesn't fit in. And you'll have other decks where this is completely amazing. Note, you pretty much always want to upgrade this thing. It gets kind of interesting at that point because when you start your turn, you always have at least 1 combo. Spending 1 combo and then gaining 2, so you've actually earned combo for doing nothing but playing the deck the way you always wanted to play it, is really interesting. You can stack additional copies of Ceaseless with like a Blackstone or something, and you could be gaining like 4 combo the first time you spend combo, which is kind of crazy. It does feed itself in that if you only spend combo once per turn, it'll always give you some back. If you run out of combo because you spend combo twice in 1 turn, then you actually have to regain combo manually to get the Ceaseless rolling again. So it kind of does cease in that regard. But in the right deck, really, really strong. In the wrong deck, kind of useless. So for that reason, it has to get a B tier. Finally, though, it's going to be a rare that gets an A tier. And that's going to be Crimson Slaughter. Crimson Slaughter is an A tier card. Triggering all bleed for 2 is pretty dang good, but what really makes this thing great is that if you upgrade it, makes every bleeding enemy get vulnerable first to really ramp up the value of those bleed triggers, right? Like, if you play Crimson Slaughter versus even, let's consider there's just 1 bleeding enemy, right? Like the Void or something. Well, okay, maybe not Void. Let's think about something like the Obsidian Golem, right? If you're fighting the Obsidian Golem and he's bleeding and you have an upgraded Crimson Slaughter, you play the Crimson Slaughter, he has 1 trigger of Bleed Vulnerable immediately because it gets triggered by the Crimson Slaughter. At the end of the turn, he takes another trigger of Bleed while vulnerable, and then next turn, he's still vulnerable, so that's at least 3 guaranteed vulnerable bleed triggers. That is so much damage. And that's just with 1 enemy. You toss more enemies into the equation, they're taking all that damage as well. The vulnerable is useful for things that are not bleed-oriented too, of course, like your regular damage-dealing attacks. That's great. It's just a super powerful card. It does a lot of great stuff. Most of that is contingent upon the upgrade. Unupgraded, this card is a little unappealing unless you're heavy on the bleed. But, you know, I mean, you are on bleed sometimes, right? Like, if you're like me, then about half the time you're playing the bleed starter deck, and that probably means that you're still using bleed damage as a somewhat significant part of your victory condition. So Crimson Slaughter really, really helps out with that. It is a very good card, I would say. Next up, we've got Deep Cuts, and Deep Cuts is going to be a C tier rare. I know. It's a sad state of affairs. This is another one of those cards that I think is super duper easy to overestimate the value of, right? 50% increase in bleed upgrades to be a 75% increase in bleed. The problem with this card is that bleed triggers exist. if you couldn't manually trigger someone's bleed with a card like Crimson Slaughter that we were just looking at, this would be a lot better. But as is, it's pretty hard to justify spending this much energy to scale up their bleed like this, when you could just be dealing the bleed damage, which, if you think about it in a way, is kind of like triggering or increasing the target's bleed by 100%. Like, you know, bear with me on this, right? Obviously, it's not a direct comparison because the bleed trigger only happens once, whereas increasing their bleed, that's going to happen every turn, right? But the better you get at Vault, the more you'll start to realize how quickly and aggressively you want to play. Most fights do not want to last more than like 4 or 5 turns, right? And oftentimes you'll be faster than that. There are a handful of fights that will almost always be slower than that, right? Like, you know, Void himself often takes upwards of 5 turns. Not always, but it does sometimes happen. But that's a pretty narrow use case for deep cuts, right? That is not super high value unless you have some sort of way to trigger bleed a bunch already, maybe in like relic form or something, right? Or unless you know that the fight is going to drag out and be slow, or if you don't have any other cards that trigger bleed by chance, maybe then you would want to deep cuts. You can Blackstone it, and, you know, that's nice, I guess, that it scales off of its own scaling. But that's so expensive at that point. 4 energy, it's just... This card is bait almost all of the time. Like, new players, I think, often see this card and immediately assume it's going to be crazy. If you've ever played Slay the Spire, you know, you think of something like Catalyst or whatever, right? But this is no Catalyst. 50% increase is just not good enough to contest with the bleed triggers. C tier for deep cuts. Next we have Gusher. Gusher is an A tier card, even in its new, significantly altered form. It's still really good because you can just play it at 0 and gain 2 Hidden Blades, right? Or you can play it at 1 and gain 3 Hidden Blades, and that's quite strong. It's really cheap Hidden Blades. I talked up stuff like Apprentice Blade and Phantom Walk for just generating a bunch of Hidden Blades, right? Well, this is pretty much the be-all, end-all in terms of getting good value for Hidden Blades, right? You just get them. It doesn't spend your combo, it doesn't require much energy, it doesn't discard anything from your hand. You just get the cards immediately. You can discard them for value, you can play them for damage, you can do whatever you want with them. Good card. Very simple and straightforward. Next card is also going to be an A tier, In Cold Blood. Yet another card that just makes deep cuts look really bad by comparison. This thing is great. The damage it deals is more or less irrelevant. 3 damage upgrades to 8 damage. At this point, it's okay, you know, but not really necessary usually. You would only upgrade this most of the time because you're already going to be playing it anyway, and so you might as well get some value that way. But triggering target's bleed on a Swift card is just crazy. That's so much damage. This is a great way to dunk bosses. This is a great way to kill the Void. This is just the capstone for any bleed-focused build. You want this card, right? It is that good. Not an S tier card because you're not always on bleed, and if you're not on bleed, this thing sucks, obviously. but when you are on bleed, oh boy, it is a house. A tier for sure. Next, we have Muted, and, I mean, it's another C-tier card. What can I say? 2 C-tier rares. Kind of weird, huh? Muted is just a little too situational, I would say, right? This card does not do anything if you aren't generating significant amounts of tokens. Sometimes you're not. And even if you are generating a lot of Hidden Blades, this can actually be a downside, right? Obviously, turning a Silent Shiv into an upgraded Silent Shiv is purely upside, right? So if you upgrade this thing, your Silent Shivs all get upgraded when you generate them. That's great. But otherwise, just turning your Hidden Blades into Silent Shivs can be bad because Silent Shivs don't deal damage immediately. If there is threat on the stack, you want to kill something right now, you know? And if an enemy is taking an action that's going to make next turn very challenging for you to handle, you want damage right now. Silent Shivs don't deal damage right now. You can really get yourself into some sticky situations when using this card. It's a 0-cost expel, which I guess is nice. It doesn't stack, so there's no shenanigans with Blackstone to be had there. Just really hard to make use of. The only time I feel great about this is if I'm using a deck that spams lots of Silent Shivs, and that doesn't happen very often. Otherwise, I think I often would prefer Hidden Blades. Also, I didn't even mention this, but Rage scaling, right? Rage does not interact with Silent Shivs. It does interact with Hidden Blades. This invalidates a lot of the benefit of your Rage. Can't give it anything better than a C tier. Next up, Once More With. This one might be a bit of a hot take. Call me crazy. Yeah. Another C tier. Another C tier card. I know that this thing statistically is very strong. I know that people like this card a lot. I don't think it's worth it most of the time. Right? What this effectively does is it lets your non-swift cards be swift, and in theory you can use it to kind of raise the combo cap in a way on your cards that are swift, right? Getting extra triggers out of them. If you like rebuild combo in between and stuff, it has its uses. You know, memes with Grape Shot are funny. It does stuff, but the vast majority of hidden decks that you're playing, either I think they don't need this card, or they can't make use of it, right? Either you can't use it, or if you can use it, you don't need to, because you're already doing well enough without it, right? It's, you know, a win more card, I guess, would be the way to describe it. I feel like if you're winning a run using Once More With, you could probably have won it without it. And it just does not really change the game that much for you. I've almost never done anything with this card, and I've played hours, and I've got like 700 hours in this game, and I've almost never used Once More With. So that's my take on it. Feel free to call me crazy. I know the numbers say it's a great card, but hey, it's my tier list. What are you gonna do? All right. Next up we have Puncture. Puncture is an easy S tier. I love Puncture. It is a nice little self-contained effect in that it gives you Hidden Blades to then make an enemy take damage to then make them bleed. If you upgrade it, of course, you're getting 2 Hidden Blades, which is great. You can Blackstone this thing, and, you know, now all of a sudden you're getting the taking damage bleed thing multiple times. You're getting 4 Hidden Blades. It's just really, really good anytime you're spamming out Hidden Blades, anytime you're dealing lots of damage in small increments. So if you have like a Sleight of Hand, if you have a Building Steam even, any sort of relic that randomly deals damage, stuff like Stone Sling, right? A lot of ways to get value off of this. Great way to keep bleed up. Great way to deal a little bit of bonus damage. Great way to get Hidden Blades. It doesn't expel. You can keep using it over and over again. Just a wonderful, wonderful card. Almost impossible to find a deck that does not want a Puncture. And keeping in the trend of S tiers, we've got Resurgence. Resurgence is also an S tier. This card is phenomenal. Even if it literally just said Purge Combo 1, it would still be a really good card. But no, that's not all it says. Instead, it has this other absolutely insane line of text: get back an expelled card. That is ridiculous. Not only does it do that, if you upgrade it, you can get a card back from the expelled pile twice. Once in the hand, once in the discard pile. And, you know, you can discard this to gain combo 2. Probably not going to happen, but hey, you know, it's an option. It's insane. It does 2 different things. They're both ridiculous. They're both very powerful. This card boggles my mind that it's allowed to exist. It's really, really good. Continuing the S tiers, we got Smoke Bomb. S for Smoke Bomb. This thing kicks butt. It is so good. Everything good I said about Resurgence more or less applies to Smoke Bomb. It deals so much damage. It is really reliable, whereas the response is a bit more variable. It has a great upgrade, getting 2 Hidden Blades. This thing is really nice to put a Queenstone in. You can get away with Blackstone in it sometime, even though it's really expensive. It'll solve your damage for a large portion of the fight. Just an incredibly potent, very, very powerful card. Almost done here. We've got Stiletto. Stiletto, I'm going to put in the A tier. It is literally just a Hidden Blade, except it is not inert, and it's like a real card you can actually put in your deck. And it turns out that's very strong. This thing is a great carrier of stones. Blue stone, in particular, is exceptional on it. Red stone is a great way to scale up your rage. It just it's good. It's very good. The upgrade is pretty reasonable as well, +2 damage per trigger. This thing pairs with so many other cards so nicely, and again, you'd be hard-pressed to find a deck that doesn't want one of these. And finally, the last card, Swift Hand. This one is another A tier. The ability to gain a volatile Swift card from either deck or discard is really, really nice. It just acts as an extra copy of whatever your best Swift card is. So you can use this to gain damage with something like a Splatter. You can use it to gain block with something like a Dueling Buckler. It gives you combo to make the Swift card better, which is insane. It expels, but you just upgrade it and then it doesn't. Keep reusing it, right? Like, if you just only have one card that you want to play a bunch of times over and over again, this is a great way to do that, right? This is a great way to abuse your jab and such. It's not an A tier, or sorry, it's not an S tier, because it doesn't fit in every deck, right? Like, sometimes maybe you're reliant upon silent shivs to like apply bleed, and then you're probably not using Swift cards in the deck to do that. Sometimes you won't have the upgrade point to spare on it because you need to actually upgrade the Swift cards themselves, and then it's just an okay value, like, filler card. You could maybe convince me that this deserves an S tier. It is usually really strong, but I think it's a little bit weaker than what I would consider S tier. Still really, really good, though. And that wraps it up. Those are all of the hidden cards. All 96 of them. Neutral cards will be done later in their own video, and all the other classes will be to come as well, probably after their patches come out and they gain a few more new cards and some rebalancing. Hope you guys all enjoyed this. Make sure to drop a subscription if you want to see more content, or go follow on Twitch if you'd like to see me do runs live, and I'll see you all next time.